Good morning. Welcome to English Mirror. Today, let's go through the text Tradition and the Individual Talent by T.S. Eliot. Often hailed as the successor to poet critics such as John Dryden, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Matthew Arnold, T.S. Eliot's literary criticism informs his poetry just as his experiences as a poet shape his critical work. Though famous for insisting on objectivity in art, Eliot's essays actually map a highly personal set of preoccupations, responses, and ideas about specific authors and works of art, as well as formulate more general theories on the connections between poetry, culture, and society. Perhaps his best known essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, was first published in 1919 and soon after included in The Sacred Wood, Essays on Poetry and Criticism, published in 1920. Eliot attempts to do two things in this essay. He first redefines tradition by emphasizing the importance of history to writing and understanding poetry, and he then argues that poetry should be essentially impersonal, that is, separate and distinct from the personality of its writer. Let's analyze the essay. The essay Tradition and the Individual Talent is an attack on certain critical views in Romanticism, particularly up on the idea that a poem is primarily an expression of the personality of the poet. Eliot argues that a great poem always asserts and that the poet must develop a sense of the pastness of the past. There is great importance of tradition in the present poem. Tradition should not be inherited but should be obtained by great labor. Past should be altered by present as much as the present is directed by past. In fact, tradition acquires a wider significance in Eliot's writing. It involves a historical sense that is really essential for any work of art. This historical sense involves a perception, not only of the pastness of past, but also its presentness. This sense compels a poet to write not only being near to his generation, but to the whole of literary tradition, starting from Homer. Thus, to write poetry is to write with a consciousness of the timeless and temporal and of the interrelation between the two. In any work, the past should be altered by the present, just as the present is directed by the past. In this way, present affects the past as past affects the present because present poet adopts the tradition of past with hard labor. A good writer or poet identifies his position in present with the comparison to past writers. Therefore, the combination of temporal and timeless is as whole tradition. The meaning of the poem is not possible in isolation. No poet nor any artist has his complete meaning unless we link him or her to a chain of all poets. Importance and value of any poet can't be judged in isolation. In English writing, we seldom speak of tradition, though we occasionally apply its name in deploring its absence. Every nation, every race has not only its own creative, but its own critical turn of mind, and is even more oblivious of the shortcomings and limitations of its critical habits than of those of its creative genius. Criticism is as inevitable as breathing. One of the facts that might come to light in this process is our tendency to insist, when we praise a poet, upon those aspects of his work in which he least resembles anyone else. In these aspects or parts of his work, we pretend to find what is individual, what is a peculiar essence of the man. We dwell with satisfaction upon the poet's difference from his predecessors, especially his immediate predecessors. We endeavor to find something that can be isolated in order to be enjoyed. Whereas, if we approach a poet without this prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. And the historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bonds, but with a feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer and within the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. This historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as of the temporal, and of the timeless and of the temporal together, is what makes a writer traditional. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of his contemporaneity. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him, for contrast and comparison, among the dead. I mean, this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. The necessity that he shall confirm, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. And so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. And this is conformity between the old and the new. Whoever has approved this idea of order, of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And the poet who is aware of this will be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities. In a peculiar sense, he will be aware also that he must inevitably be judged by the standards of the past. I say judged, not amputated by them. Not judged to be as good as, or worse or better than the dead, and certainly not judged by the canons of dead critics. It is a judgment, a comparison, in which two things are measured by each other. And we do not quite say that the new is more valuable because it fits in. But its fitting in is a test of its value. A test, it is true, which can only be slowly and cautiously applied. For we are none of us infallible judges of conformity. To proceed to a more intelligible exposition of the relation of the poet to the past, he can neither take the past as a lump, an indiscriminate bolus, nor can he form himself wholly on one or two private admirations, nor can he form himself wholly upon one preferred period. The first cause is inadmissible. The second is an important experience of youth. And the third is a pleasant and highly desirable supplement. The poet must be very conscious of the main current, which does not at all flow invariably through the most distinguished reputations. He must be quite aware of the obvious fact that art never improves, but that the material of art is never quite the same. He must be aware that the mind of Europe, the mind of his own country, a mind which he learns in time to be much more important than his own private mind, is a mind which changes, and that this change is a development which abandons nothing en route, which does not superannuate either Shakespeare or Homer or the rock drawing of the Magdalenian draughtsman. The difference between the present and the past is that the conscious present is an awareness of the past in a way and to an extent which the past awareness of itself cannot show. Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. What is to be insisted upon is that the poet must develop or procure the consciousness of the past, and that he should continue to develop this consciousness throughout his career. What happens is a continual surrender of himself, as he is at the moment, to something which is more valuable. The progress of an artist is a continual self sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality. There remains to define this process of depersonalization and its relation to the sense of tradition. It is in this depersonalization that art may be said to approach the condition of science. Part 2. Honest criticism and sensitive appreciation is directed not upon the poet but upon the poetry. In the last article, I tried to point out the importance of the relation of the poem to other poems by other authors and suggested the conception of poetry as a living whole of all the poetry that has ever been written. The other aspect of this impersonal theory of poetry is the relation of the poem to its author. And I hinted by an analogy that the mind of the mature poet differs from that of the immature one, not precisely in any valuation of personality, not being necessarily more interesting or having more to say, but rather by being a more finely perfected medium in which special or very varied feelings are at liberty to enter into new combinations. The analogy was that of the catalyst. When the two gases previously mentioned are mixed in the presence of a filament of platinum, they form sulfurous acid. This combination takes place only if the platinum is present. Nevertheless, the newly formed acid contains no trace of platinum, and the platinum itself is apparently unaffected, has remained inert, neutral, and unchanged. The mind of the poet is the shred of platinum. It may partly or exclusively operate upon the experience of the man himself. But the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. The more perfectly will be the mind digest and transmute the passions which are its material. The experience, you will notice, the elements which enter the presence of the transforming catalyst are of two kinds, emotions and feelings. The effect of a work of art upon the person who enjoys it is an experience different in kind from any experience not of art. It may be formed out of one emotion, or maybe a combination of several or various feelings, inherring for the writer in particular words or phrases or images, may be added to compose the final result. Or great poetry may be made without the direct use of any emotion whatever, composed out of feeling solely. The poet's mind is in fact a receptacle for seizing and storing up numberless feelings, phrases, images, which remain there until all the particles which can unite to form a new compound are present together. For it is not the greatness, the intensity of the emotions, the components, but the intensity of the artistic process, the pressure, so to speak, under which the fusion takes place, that counts. Great variety is possible in the process of transmution of emotion. The difference between art and the event is always absolute. The point of view which I am struggling to attack is perhaps related to the metaphysical theory of the substantial unity of the soul. For my meaning is that the poet has not a personality to express, but a particular medium, which is only a medium and not a personality, in which impressions and experiences combine in peculiar and unexpected ways. Impressions and experiences which are important for the man may take no place in the poetry, and those which become important in the poetry may play quite a negligible part in the man, the personality. The business of the poet is not to find new emotions, but to use the ordinary ones, and in working them up into poetry, to express feelings which are not in actual emotions at all. And emotions which he has never experienced will serve his turn as well as those familiar to him. Consequently, we must believe that emotion recollected in tranquility is an inexact formula, for it is neither emotion nor recollection, nor without distortion of meaning tranquility. It is a concentration and a new thing resulting from the concentration of a very great number of experiences, which to the practical and active person would not seem to be experiences at all. It is a concentration which does not happen consciously or of deliberation. In fact, the bad poet is usually unconscious where he ought to be conscious, and conscious where he ought to be unconscious. Both errors tend to make him personal. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. But of course, only those who have personality and emotions know what it means to want to escape from these things. Part 3. This essay proposes to halt at the frontier of metaphysics or mysticism, and confine itself to such practical conclusions as can be applied by the responsible person interested in poetry. To divert interest from the poet to the poetry is a laudable aim, for it would conduce to a juster estimation of actual poetry, good and bad. There are many people who appreciate the expression of sincere emotion in verse, and there is a smaller number of people who can appreciate technical excellence. But very few know when there is expression of significant emotion, emotion which has its life in the poem and not in the history of the poet. The emotion of art is impersonal, and the poet cannot reach this impersonality without surrendering himself wholly to the work to be done. To create a good poem, one should surrender the self. The self sacrifice of personality gives birth to a good poem. One should negate his mind. In doing so, one loses his individuality and his personality. All the personal emotions, feelings, and experience should be sacrificed. There should not be the personal image of poet in his poetry. Poetry should be impersonal. But it does not mean that the poet should not write his personal feelings, but their personal feelings should be converted into art's feelings. Therefore, we as a critic should not look for personality of poet in his poem because the text is objective. The theory that the poet should surrender his personality is depersonalization. The poet's personal feelings and emotions should be depersonalized. He must be an impersonal and objective like a scientist. Thank you for watching this video. If you like the video, please share and subscribe.